The question asks to assess the view that wealth remains the main determinant of political power in all situations, everywhere. As the assertion in the question suggests, wealth has been and still is crucial to determining who gets what, when and how, and indeed possibly why, in all political situations. Any cursory glance at history would tend to affirm the assertion. In feudal times, a combination of landed aristocracies, monarchs and church divided up the states and empires and applied their justice of one form or another upon a poor and subjugated peasantry. The French Revolution arguably saw the capitalist class emerge to supplant the landed class, but again, as Marxist and indeed most elite thinkers would have it, power followed the money. Even in so-called representative democracies, political power is seen to be disproportionately in the hands of the few. Yet, for pluralists, this seems to be less and less the case. Surely the events of the Arab Spring, the earlier rise of protests to communist plutarchies in Eastern Europe in the 1980s and 1990s, and the increasing challenges to wealth and privilege as exercised in the environmental, feminist and anti-capitalist movements in the West, at least puts other determinants such as people power, knowledge, independent thinking, religion, human rights and freedom as factors in shaping who gets what, when, how, and indeed why. This answer will examine the evidence of power determinants by considering electoral politics, power in the developing world, the influence of corporations, the views of the main elite thinkers, pluralists and Marxist thinkers. Recently, Peter Krutus was forced to resign as newspapers revealed how, as Tory treasurer, he was claiming that Premier League access to the Prime Minister could be had for £250,000 donation to the Conservative coffers. For elitists and particularly Marxists, this is evidence of how those in power are both reliant upon those with either personal wealth or corporate wealth when it comes to access or influence in terms of policy making in the state. Pluralists might accept that access is tilted towards the financially powerful, but access alone does not mean that the state will pursue their pet policies. And the fact that the Sunday Times, part of the empire of Rupert Murdoch, actually revealed the Dinners for Donors affair suggests that there is much more independence and competition for power, in line with the thinking of Robert Dahl. Marxist thinkers, such as Christian Laslet, seen here on the left, with John Pilger and Noam Chomsky amongst others, would counter by saying that the revelation is a necessary safety valve in the capitalist state to create the smokescreen of fairness, and the story does little to change the fundamental structure of the capitalist state, which protects an inequality where, in line with the classical elitist, such as Pareto, that 80% of the political power, and with it 80% of the wealth, is exercised by 20% of the population. At the same time as the Dinners for Donations story broke, the Unite Union, the largest financial support of the Labour Party, was in the spotlight over the threatened strike of oil tanker drivers. Like the Krutus story, it raises concerns about how viable democracy is in a society where either corporate checks or union checks can bankroll the two political parties that usually occupy the main political levers of power in the UK. The fact that Miliband is partially distancing himself from the strike might back the Marxist view that, as with Blair and Brown, the appearance of an alternative to capitalist supporting politics was just that, an appearance. In fact, they would say that the Labour Party is essentially a capitalist party with a small c, and largely unwilling or unable to challenge the status quo. Pluralists would counter that the two stories combined are a perfect example of the competitive elites that so many issues revolve around. They see the Unite Union pushing its sectional interests and the media, political parties and business interests involved in a likely compromise and negotiation that forms much of the pluralist narrative. They see Unite Union pushing sectional interests in the media, political parties and business interests involved in a likely compromise negotiation forms much of the pluralist narrative. Even some pluralist commentators, however, would concede that both stories also raise the issue of the need for state funding of political parties and limits to contributions by non-governmental organisations, such as unions or business groups. Here we see evidence that democracy, while still possible, is certainly corrupted by either the power of a union, which itself is a minority, and by the hands of business seeking to protect its status. One of the concerns of pluralist thinkers is the electoral system, particularly in the United States, has been corrupted by the influence of corporate wealth. The view that money or wealth does not only talk political stateside, but it actually shouts. In spite of federal laws, which supposedly limit finance contributions and individual contributions to candidates to $2,500 in the wake of the Watergate scandal, the invoking of Section 527 of the tax code was allowed independent expenditure to bypass these restrictions, and has seen the emergence of super PACs, which have been particularly prominent in the race for the Republican presidential candidature. Marxists are hardly surprised at the way that rich men and corporations wish to keep or put into power those politicians which will benefit their interests. They would agree with the view expressed recently in the Week magazine that the presidency is being bought. Pluralists are further worried by the individuals such as Foster Friess, who has given over $1 million to Rick Santorum in the pursuit of a set of right-wing policies, out of kilter with the mainstream views that indeed threaten the unity of the Republican Party. The point of this wealth as a determinant of power is that it used to buy airtime, to show negative ads against opponents, which seem to have partly explained Romney's success, and he has by far the most money within the Republican race. The charge is that political power is bought and the US risks becoming a plutocracy. Institutions of state, which are supposedly independent, like the Supreme Court, seem to be fueling this distortion of democracy via rulings such as Citizens United in 2010. Some commentators are less worried, and while they see rich men like Friess, Adelson and Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal, throw millions of dollars at the primary races, they see it as largely neutral. They see one super PAC cancel out another, and the fact that Romney will most possibly win is proof that mainstream Republican politics is insulated by the threats from the cranky and rich who have backed the other candidates. The whole notion of wealth being the basis of electoral politics took a knock in 2008, when ordinary citizens via the internet were able collectively to outspend the super PACs in their mobilisation for Obama. Again in 2012, it looks as though small donations from millions of Democrat supporters will push the Obama coffers to $1 billion, and thus counter the wealth factor in the campaign. He arguably has accumulated wealth, but this is based on 1.3 million donors who contribute $250 or less. In some senses, this is a good example of citizens investing in the political process, and for pluralists, proof that it is impossible to run elections without money, but that money does not necessarily corrupt the process. Of course, supporters of the much less expensive UK elections point to the way that genuine political competition is protected by not allowing a marketplace for parties to buy airtime. That said, the individual and corporate backers of the Conservatives, like John Ashcroft, and the weight of union funds for Labour, does still raise questions about how cash can undermine the electoral system. Overall, it is hard to imagine US politics without disproportionate wealth being used to influence the outcome. Supporters link it to the basics of the Constitution and ultimately argue that if every vote is equal regardless of wealth, average Joe has the same number of votes as Jeffrey Katzenberg. Critics, however, are concerned that wealth is used to misrepresent, such as the money used to undermine John Kerry's war record by Texas billionaire Harold Simmons. That said, if rich people and companies are prepared to use their money to attack other rich people, then it could be said to be a competitive and level playing field. The problem arises because there is what elitists such as C. Wright Mills saw as an iron law of oligarchy, with the struggle for power being somewhat illusory, and the struggle indeed was within a very narrow part of the political spectrum. For critics of the American political system like Noam Chomsky, this illusion of competition is designed to manufacture consent and deprive voters of any real choice. Linked to the wealth equals political power is the recent data that shows that in 1912, the top 2% of Americans owned 60% of its assets, whilst the bottom 60% owned just 5%. By 2012, the figures, which had contracted somewhat during the 50s and 60s, were back to their 1912 gap. The gap had been reduced by an inheritance tax and more union rights. Both of these measures are dead in the water in 2012. Even in the UK, whilst there is general public outrage at bank bonuses, there seems to be paralysis in the central state to engage in such measures as mansion taxes. The conclusion of Marxists would be that the state is the handmaiden of capitalism, and as such is staffed by those who at best modify the excesses of capitalism. It was Ed Miliband's Marxist father, Ralph, who recognised this form of managerial capitalism back in the 1960s. If he was alive today, he might wonder how far his sons were socialised into thinking that wealth creation was not to be hindered. In the 2004 Canadian documentary, The Corporation, it was an attempt to expose the power of large corporations like Shell, Nike, Coca-Cola, IBM, etc., as the brokers of political power throughout history and in the modern era. Suggestions that IBM effectively had money out of the computer, made money out of the computer card system used to document the Holocaust, and that Coca-Cola created Fanta to ensure its profits in Nazi Germany, were made as part of a view that corporations will essentially shore up any regime in the world as long as it allows it to maximise its profits. The more recent documentary, Inside Job, also followed the way that wealth of the type generated by hedge fund managers and derivatives saw Lehman Brothers and AIG and Bear Stearns, Moody's and other Wall Street-based financial houses play a form of Russian roulette with the global economy. The current downturn in many of the advanced democracies of Europe seems to suggest that a failure to regulate such organisations as the banks and the city traders has allowed for a political landscape that sees governments in hock to the financial institutions. Elite thinkers such as Naomi Klein see this as evidence of this form of wealth holding the democratic process to ransom. Some pluralists and indeed elite thinkers are more sanguine and view movements like the Occupy Wall Street and its global variants as evidence that the public outcry against the nexus between those in power and in politics, and organisations like Goldman Sachs as evidence of a grassroots movement rejecting what Marxists view as the likely behaviour of rampant and unregulated capitalism. Policies to regulate and break up investment and commercial banking are at least on the political agenda. For some pluralists and indeed left-of-centre politicians, wealth should be the basis of political power. They would cite how the New Deal in America was only possible because the federal government under FDR took under its control so much of the productive wealth of society and allowed the state to put America back to work. Equally, the welfare state in the UK depends upon the state having huge tax-raising powers. Even the current coalition governments demands the power to raise revenue and eat into private sources of wealth such as pension funds and incomes, and spending as justification for settling the economy in the face of a recession. Wealth in its simplest sense is fundamental to the exercise of power and is legitimised by the electorate who give such power to democratically elected governments. In global terms, there is a strong correlation in terms of diplomatic power between wealth and power. Whilst rich countries can apply sanctions and even force poor countries to choose one type of leadership over another if that suits their commercial interests, the world has become a much messier place post the end of communism and more so post 9/11. In the early 1990s, political scientist and economist Francis Fukuyama argued in the end of history and of the end of history and the emergence of liberal democracies as the only and final type of political system. Whilst wealth would still be a factor in shaping power in these societies, the pluralist catechism of checks and balances, safeguards for minorities and a codified constitution with independent media and judiciary will all triumph and tend to ameliorate any attempts of rich men to buy power. In recent years, Fukuyama has written about the wealth gaps in Latin America and how they impeded social and political development. There seems a paradox here. Brazil, for instance, is a fast-growing economy and has thrown off its reputation for corrupt and military-dominated governments. Its most recent leaders, like President Lula, have come from humble origins. He was a shoeshine boy from the favela. However, the gap between rich and poor is greater in Brazil than anywhere else. The super-rich in Brazil have been key in blocking significant conservation legislation designed to protect the poor and vulnerable indigenous tribes of the Amazon. In terms of the question, it can be noted that even in developing democracies, the power of wealth often shapes the political agenda. Many elitists, such as C. Wright Mills, were keen to highlight how the military dominated the political process in many countries. Here, the link with wealth is not so straightforward. In many African countries in the post-colonial phase, It was the officer class that had the education and skills to run newly independent states like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya and the Congo. However, many of these countries have experienced perversion of the tenets of independence, such as raising the quality of life for all the people in favour of feathering a nest of usually Swiss bank accounts of dictators. So, even if the military are not themselves wealthy, the power of the military in states like Pakistan and Egypt has allowed them to also acquire control over significant wealth. It is as if there is a symbiotic relationship between coercive power and wealth, particularly in states where the military have come to command the institutions of the state. A CNN report recently noted that prominent dictators such as Than Shwe of Burma has amassed a personal fortune of $4 billion. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme ruler of Iran, has an estimated fortune of $30 billion in spite of his outward show of austerity. The whole survey shows a close relationship between political power and the amassing of personal fortunes. In short, many of these states are little more than gangster states, where, through control over the apparatus of state coercion, the courts and the media, such men as Assad in Syria and Rahman in Tajikistan have built their personal power and those of their rich associates around them. The challenge to this may have come in the way that popular risings against Mubarak and Gaddafi were partly based upon the way they siphoned off state assets and left the bulk of the population in poverty. So the question might also see the conclusion that the abuse of power in terms of accumulating wealth that fails to address social inequalities can lead to violent overthrows of such regimes. As said at the outset, there are other determinants of who or what exercises power globally. For feminists such as Pamela Haag, there is the view that historically wealth has been in the hands of men, and therefore women's relative underrepresentation in politics is a direct correlation to their marginalised economic position. Even with what pluralists would see as women-friendly policies and benefits, welfare and equal pay, the disparity between women and men in even advanced and liberal democracies, never mind the closed and enslaving type of states typical of many Islamic states, has meant that their lack of wealth and gender persecution go hand in hand. Again, wealth seems to underpin or exacerbate the discrimination. In Northern Ireland, the conflict had at its heart disagreement over national identity, which was fuelled by religion. For Marxists, the way in which the working classes were divided over a false consciousness related to religion was part of the policy of colonial leaders and capitalists to divide and rule. The price might be civil unrest, but the possibility of class solidarity between Protestants and Catholics was much more worrying to their economic interests. The mantra that better to be a second-class citizen as a Protestant than a third-class Catholic was powerful enough to maintain this divide. Religion also reverberates in many societies. In the Islamic world, it is part of the DNA of politics. In some cases, as with say the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it reflects anti-Western, anti-corruption, anti-modernist and anti-wealth. Its rejection of conventional sources of wealth appeals to what Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, and many of the liberation movements in Africa and Latin America have reflected this view. Evo Morales in Bolivia and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela have been poster boys for this, as Nkrumah was in Ghana and indeed Mugabe in his early days in Zimbabwe. Critics not, however, show that once they gain the levers of power through mass support, they fall into self-aggrandisement and surround themselves with an elite that is keen to consolidate its own personal wealth. Yet again, the assertion in the question seems to hold true, though Marxist supporters of such regimes point out that such leaders have attempted to redistribute wealth and that they face external threats from the real masters of the universe, as Chomsky calls them, the United States as a proxy for the US and other global corporate interests. Chomsky frequently cites how the whole of the US foreign policy, and arguably that of Western powers and new economic giants China and Russia, is one of using their wealth to shape who is in power and under what terms they govern for the vast majority of nation states in the world. Ethnicity and race have also been seen as contenders for determining political power regionally and globally. It took until 2008 for an African American to fill the highest political office in the US, but most would argue that in spite of black civil rights movements, that the relative lack of economic power has left more blacks within the underclass more likely to be in prison and more likely to be victims of unemployment, ill health and crime. South Africa seems to counter the view of wealth and political power, since the development of political democracy in the 1990s. Yet economic power in South Africa is overwhelmingly in the hands of white-owned companies, and the black majority have effectively compromised their power to the vast wealth, and some would say knowledge, of the white minority. Pluralists would still see the situation in South Africa as one of transition, and note how the white-owned mines and factories have had to act to improve the lot of their largely black workforce, and that democratic institutions can and do rein in the wealthy for the benefit of all. In conclusion, it is hard not to accept the view that wealth and political power are intricately linked together. But the pluralists do have some strong points when they highlight how popular protest can and does counter the power of the dollar or the euro. Marxists tend to stress two things: the desire of capitalism to maximise profit in the hands of the few, and thus the likely inequalities that follow in terms of wealth distribution. They also challenge the view that capitalism is entirely dominant, and look to the various challenges to capitalism currently seen in the global economic downturn as a reason to believe that a revolutionary period will see the dismantling of capitalism in line with what Marx himself described as the expropriators being expropriated, or that the capitalist class will become its own gravediggers. Elements of religion, nationalism, feminism and ethnicity should not be discounted, but with all these elements, wealth seems to underpin the distribution of political power, and these are seen by various elite thinkers as just as important as determinants of power as wealth. Pluralists have a more optimistic view of the distribution of power and see that wealth equals huge political power as exaggerated and too simplistic, as they stress the democratic rules of societies that sees even the wealthy like James Murdoch being brought to book and forced to stand down from many of his powerful positions.